Hello and welcome to another episode of Crops TV. My name is Josh Schmickel, field agronomist with Iowa State University. And today we're going to talk about forage evaluation and renovation after a drought. And this is a pretty important topic this year because in some areas across the state, we've had 2 going on 3 years of less than average precipitation, and with a very cold winter, potentially for some of us, that's going to put even more stress on a lot of our forages. So the discussion for today, we're going to talk about the extended drought conditions that have gone across the state for most of us. And after that, we'll talk about how to properly evaluate your alfalfa field. And then we'll switch gears and talk about how to properly evaluate pastures. And we'll talk about some management considerations with each of those, and we'll finish up with some best management practices and some things to think about if we need to take action and make some renovations. So this was the current drought map for the state of Iowa here at the end of 2023. As you can see, a lot of the Midwest is currently in a D1 or worse drought. Iowa is leading the charge right now at 83%. To the south of us, Missouri is in at 72%, Kansas 53%, Minnesota 40%, Illinois 38%. Wisconsin, they were in a drought for most of the growing season of 2023. They've been able to alleviate a lot of that, but they're still in there around 37%, and Nebraska finishes up at 26%. But as you can see, across a good swath of the Midwest, apart from really, the Dakotas and western Nebraska, a lot of the Midwest is still dealing with some extended drought conditions. When we look at the U.S. seasonal drought outlook, this was the outlook that came through later this fall and will carry through here for the beginning at least of 2024. So drought persists across much of the high plains in the upper Midwest. Again, we saw those extended drought conditions from the previous slide. Now, the interesting thing is, though, that Drought Monitor did say that hopefully a lot of this drought would be improved. And one thing that we have seen, at least in Iowa, we have been able to take advantage of some excess moisture that we normally wouldn't receive. We haven't had really a deep frost so far, this fall, this winter. So any excess moisture that we have been able to get has thankfully soaked into the ground. So we are getting a little bit of bonus moisture there that we potentially would normally miss out on. Looking back at our growing season for 2023. So this is a map of the water year, and it's the percent of normal precipitation. And you can see that Iowa as a whole generally came up pretty short. There are a couple patches here and there where we were close to 100%, the areas in gray. But generally, as we look at the yellows and the darker, warmer colors, we can see that a pretty good swath of the state, especially, everything from south central, southeast Iowa up towards north central, northeast, and even into western Iowa. It wasn't uncommon where we saw anywhere from 90, 75%, even down to 50% of our normal precipitation. So this past growing season, we definitely saw some extended drought conditions across the vast majority of the state. If we go to the year prior, back in 2022, looked at the same map, you can see that besides northeast Iowa and far eastern Iowa, where we actually came up a little bit on the high side, again, we had some pretty severe deficits. Again, southeast Iowa down to south central, and not surprisingly, north central, northwest, into western Iowa, where again we saw anywhere from 90, 75% of the normal precipitation, all the way down to 50% or less of the normal precipitation that we would typically expect for that growing season. And we go back 1 year further, back to 2021. Again, you can see we had a few little pockets of isolated above average precipitation, but again, there's a pretty wide swath across, eastern Iowa, central, into north central, and even in parts of northwest Iowa, where unfortunately, for a third year now, we've had some below average precipitation. So what does this have to do with our forages? So something to think about. It's not such a big deal if maybe you only have, part of a growing season or maybe just one growing season where you may have below average precipitation. But when you consecutively have below average precipitation for 1, 2, possibly 3 years, that's going to start taking a pretty heavy toll on your forages. And alfalfa normally may not see a lot of stress because alfalfa does have a pretty dense root system, and those roots can go down pretty far. But when you do have limited moisture available for 2, maybe 3 growing seasons, that can have a pretty severe effect. So obviously, we could significantly reduce that alfalfa yield. The timing of that drought stress is going to be very critical, however. So is that stress coming on at the beginning of the year before that first cutting? Is it taking place during most of the growing season throughout the summer, where that's going to limit the number of cuttings that you may or may not have? Or is that drought stress coming on at the end of the year when we really want to try to focus on letting that alfalfa crop gain some growth, anywhere from 6 to 8 inches of growth, so we can get good baseline of stored carbohydrates in those roots leading up to winter, so that way, we increase the survivability of that alfalfa plant through the wintertime. So the timing of that drought stress is pretty critical. When we do see alfalfa plants that have been influenced by drought stress, we can see a number of those basal buds, shoots, and stems per plant are greatly reduced. This especially happens right after harvest, within 10 to 14 days after harvest. Essentially what happens is the stem internodes become greatly reduced, the plants get shorter, the flowering is then at a reduced plant height. This obviously does have a pretty big impact on the total amount of nitrogen in that plant as well. When we have shorter plants, we can expect that overall plant nitrogen is probably going to be reduced as well. And then leading from that, our NDF is also generally going to be decreased because of that severity and the timing of stress as well. So here's a couple pictures. This was a new alfalfa seeding, and unfortunately we did have some drought stress occur shortly after that. So on your left-hand side, this is just a general view of the field, and you can see that we did have a nurse crop out there beforehand. Nurse crop's been taken off, and you can see that there is some alfalfa plants coming in, but it's pretty sparse, kind of patchy in a few areas. You can see some streaks. And the picture on the right is just a close-up, and you can see where we definitely have some patches, and there's some pretty good-sized bare spots, especially for this being a brand new seeding. We probably have some issues here that are going to need to be addressed. When we're going out in the alfalfa field and we're going to evaluate that stand, there's a few different ways to do this. This is just one way that I think is probably the easiest. First, we should look at what kind of risk assessment are we putting that alfalfa stand under? How many cuts are we taking per season? Are we in the southern half of the state, the northern half of the state? And how many cuttings? So if you're in southern Iowa, obviously you do have a little bit longer growing season. You can get by with probably one more cutting versus the northern half of the state. And, if you're taking a lot of cuttings, that's obviously putting more stress on that field. Going to be a little bit higher risk. The bottom half of the table there, table 2, we look at the age of the stand and the rating of that winter survival. On the left-hand side there, you can see, is it a first-year seeding, a second-year stand, third-year stand, or fourth or older? And then you just simply go out. You can take a 1 square foot. You can make it out of PVC, or they do make a commercial, 1 foot square. Throw it out there. Obviously going to be in several random places around the field. You're not going to pick the best or the worst places. You want to get a general feel for the entire field, and you're simply going to go out and count the number of plants per square foot. And going off those numbers, you can figure out, do you still have a good stand? Is it marginal, or do you need to think about potentially reseeding that stand? Along with that, though, and counting your plants, it's not just about counting the plants. You actually need to dig the plants up and take a look and see how well are those plants doing. Do they have any issues, crown or root rot, other things like that. And that leads to our next slide here with the information on checking those plants. The ideal time is to do it when that regrowth is at least 3 to 4 inches tall. Again, get out your 1 foot square. Want to do this approximately every 5 to 10 acres, depending how big the field is. But within that square, checking every plant, check all the crowns, check the tap roots to evaluate the tissue. Pull out your pocket knife, slice those tap roots open, and check and see. Is it, do we have some really nice white solid root tissue? Do we have some injuries? Maybe we do. Is it a slight amount of injury where the root's just slightly brown, but there's really not a whole lot of damage? Or, like the image on the far right, we have some dead and dying roots. That root tissue is getting discolored, it's mushy, it's starting to get rotten. All this is going to come into play because when we check all the plants inside that 1 foot square, you really only want to count the healthy plants in that, okay? So here's an example. So here's some pictures. Went out, had a square, threw it out there, counted all the plants, dug it up, and then actually used a pocket knife and sliced them open. And from far away, they probably look like they're doing okay. But now there is that plant in the far top right-hand corner. Sliced it open, and in this example, circled it there in red, and you can see that we are starting to have some issues there all of a sudden. Probably looked fine from the outside, but you slice it open, and now we have some brown, mushy, discolored areas. It's not dead, it's not decayed, but how well is that plant going to survive? It'll probably be fine this growing season. It's probably going to be questionable for the next growing season if this is a stand that's allowed to continue. So some management considerations for established stand. So this is going to be past that initial seeding. This is going to be your second, third, fourth year stands. And this is going to be in a moisture limited environment or after a drought. Okay. So if the stand is over 10 inches tall and flowering, harvest, take a cutting if it's economic to do so. Does it pencil out? Okay. You're going to have to run the numbers, make sure it pencils out for your time, your fuel, your acres, how much tonnage does it pencil out, okay? Cut it at your normal cutting height. Cutting it higher isn't going to help. Don't buzz it shorter than you normally would. Just cut it at your normal cutting height and everything will be fine. The nice thing about these alfalfa plants is they can regrow from the axillary buds on the stubble. Just remember that a lot of those shoots are going to be smaller. We're going to see some lower yields than if it was growing from the stems from the crown buds, okay? So just something to think about. That if you do take a cutting like that, you're gonna see some lower yields in your subsequent cuttings, okay? When possible, try to let those plants approach 100% bloom before harvest to allow the building of some of those carbohydrate reserves. If you continually take a cutting earlier, before bloom, pre-bloom, you're stealing a lot of those carbohydrate reserves from the plants that they're going to need later on, that are going to help them get through some stressful environments. All right. Some other considerations to think about. If your stand is less than 10 inches tall and flowering, let it go. Don't worry about it. Don't cut it. Let that regrowth come through the existing growth. It's not going to hurt anything, all right? Kind of like what I said in the previous slide, mowing will not increase the regrowth, and just let it go. You're going to cause more damage than good, and it's just economically not going to pencil out. That being said, letting this regrowth continue, you're letting that stand stay out there, letting the crop you're letting that crop stay out there. You do need to keep a very watchful eye on your insect pests. So need to still make sure you're doing a good job, because in this type of environment, they're still hungry. They're still looking for food. So we do need to keep a close eye on them and manage that appropriately. Leaf hoppers especially could be pretty troublesome in some areas, especially during drought conditions. Armyworms as well. The other thing to keep in mind with established stands is make sure that your soil fertility is at optimal levels. And we'll talk more about this here in a little bit. When we look at considerations for new seedings, so this is going to be your first year, okay? Try to avoid taking a cutting when we have some drought stress periods. Now, that being said, if very early on in the spring we do have quite a bit of moisture, things look good, or if it's the very end of the year and we have adequate moisture, yeah, then it's probably okay. Take a cutting, especially if you need it. I completely understand that. But for the rest of the growing season, if you have a drought stress period, try to let it go, all right? There's no reason to put undue stress on those plants for no reason, all right? There is a key with taking that fall cutting. We want to try to time that fall cutting so that way we either have no regrowth at frost, or we need to make sure that we allow enough time to at least get 6 to 8 inches of regrowth before frost. Okay, again, the whole point of that is we want to make sure that we have enough stored carbohydrates in the roots to try to give those plants the best chance of making it through winter as much as possible. All right. Dry periods after seeding may result in poorer stands and non-extensive root systems. So in the very beginning of this presentation, I talked about how alfalfa plants generally have a really great root system. Don't see too many issues. Unfortunately, if we have some dry periods right after trying to get a new stand established, it's just not going to be an opportunity for those root systems to get established and start getting down looking for water. So just something to consider and think about, all right? Along with that, because they don't have a very extensive root system that's developed yet, we are going to see a lot of those plants are going to have an increased need for water, probably going to flower earlier than expected, and we could also see some lower than average fiber digestibility, okay? Some other management considerations for that brand new seeding. A drought in late summer, early fall could reduce some of those stored carbohydrates for winter survival and spring growth. Now, how is that going to affect those plants and their ability to make it through the winter? Well, that's really going to depend on what kind of winter we have and the snow cover. So right now, in the winter of 2023, coming into 2024 here for the new year, how's our winter look right now? Right now, we really haven't had very cold temperatures, but however, we really haven't had any snow cover. Remember that we really need quite a few inches of snow cover, 5-6 inches of snow cover to really provide a really nice insulation layer to protect those crowns and those plants from very cold temperatures. And without that snow, if we do get some very cold temperatures here in January, February, that could have a pretty negative effect on the survivability of a lot of these alfalfa plants across the state. So to be determined, we'll wait and see how it goes. Now, one of the positives of having some drier soil is drier soils do actually enhance the survivability of alfalfa plants because it does provide a little bit of insulation for that crown, better from very cold air temperatures, and it can also result in less root diseases. So I guess there is somewhat of a silver lining with some dry soils to help alfalfa out. The problem is we do need to get some moisture. Right now, like I said, most of Iowa, we're still in a D1 or worse drought. So we're going to need some soil moisture. Hopefully we get that by March so that way we can start to see some really good root growth and we can see some really good yields and cuttings here for this next growing season, right? When we talk about fertilizer for alfalfa fields, and this is going to follow over into pastures here later on in this talk as well, I tell guys, think about it as a fertilizer step ladder. So obviously we start on the bottom step, we work our way up. So the very first thing that you should focus on and concentrate on is going to be your buffer pH and liming. So notice I said your buffer pH and not plain pH. So when we go out and we do soil testing, your pH is going to tell us if we need to add lime. Your buffer pH is going to tell us how much. And we'll get into this here in just a little bit. But your adding lime is the easiest, most cost-effective thing that you can do to try to help your alfalfa fields and your pastures out. The next thing we should focus on is going to be your phosphorus and your potassium. Once we get those in line and get those levels addressed, then the next thing would be nitrogen. Not necessary for alfalfa, obviously, it produces all of its own. And for pastures, we'll get to that here in just a little bit. If it's a lot of grasses, yes, nitrogen is going to be beneficial. If a third of your pasture stand is in legumes, So red clover, white clover, whatever it might be, then nitrogen is really not going to be beneficial. So nitrogen, maybe, depends, okay? And then the next would be sulfur. And we are starting to see quite a few fields that could have some sulfur deficiencies. If you are worried about that, there is more information that you can find through Iowa State's website on sulfur deficiencies in alfalfa, and that link will be posted down below. And then the last thing would be boron and other nutrients. But again, that's really going to depend on what the testing shows. Pretty rare that we're going to get to that stage. Like I said, the first things that we really need to focus on is going to be your pH, your lime, your P and K. If those first things are in line, then really you're sitting pretty good. So why is soil pH important? And I get this question all the time from farmers. So why should I really care about pH? Like I said here just a little bit ago, it's the easiest thing to take care of, the most cost effective, and everything else kind of really is based on your pH. So I really like this chart because it tells us exactly how all these other nutrients and minerals, if you don't have a proper pH, it's a lot harder for the plant to take advantage of these, okay? When we look at target pHs, alfalfa is going to be in right there at a 6.9. Your other forages, like a pasture, are going to be at 6.0. So not too bad at all. So another way to think about fertilizer is we can also look at the crop removal rates. So for example, here in the red rectangle, we have the removal rates for alfalfa, alfalfa grass, and some red clover grass. And you can see that for each ton that's removed, you can see exactly how much phosphorus and how much potassium is being removed. And it's always really surprising to guys when I pull out this chart and they look at it, and they're always very surprised at the amount of potassium that's taken out for each ton of that alfalfa, or that grassy hay. Even a little bit further down there in the blue rectangle, you can see a lot of our grasses. And again, for each ton that's taken off, again, there's quite a bit of potassium that's really taken off. Looking at your soil recommendations from your soil fertility test is great. That's going to get you in those optimal levels. Once you do reach those optimal levels, then when you look at these crop removal rates, this is a way to help you maintain those optimal rates as well, okay? So after we get done looking at all that, now we're going to look at some renovation practices and some things to think about, okay? So first, we've gone out, we've evaluated the alfalfa stands. Depending on how good that stand looks, do you need to replant it? You're going to have to make that decision, but here today I've given you the information to help you make that educated decision, okay? Again, we want to try to maintain those top yields. We may need to replant if that stand is starting to get pretty poor, okay? If you do need to plant some alfalfa, try to plant it with some oats or a ryegrass cover crop. This is going to absolutely help increase some of that early season yield. I've mentioned this once before, but again, need to make sure that we maintain soil fertility levels. We don't want to add to the stress level for those plants. If we have adequate soil fertility levels, that's just taking one less thing off that they're going to have to worry about besides a limited moisture environment. For a new seeding that's coming on, prepare to fertilize that alfalfa field after that first cutting, especially if you did have some low levels of potassium and sulfur that you were making up for, getting that soil prepped for before you made that new cutting, okay? Obviously, anytime you can try to apply fertilizer with rainfall is going to be highly beneficial. The biggest thing is you really don't want to have a lot of that fertilizer just sitting out there for a long period of time with no rainfall on it. That's going to cause some additional stress. Obviously, if we could predict when it's going to rain, that would be great. Try to make an application when your forecast looks really, really positive for some really, pretty good chances of some showers. Some other things to think about here with alfalfa renovation and some best management practices. I mentioned this earlier about, your IPM scouting and trying to really make sure that we're controlling those insect pests. So the picture here on the right, perfect example of some leaf hoppers. This was a picture I took a couple summers ago. Leaf hoppers, they come and go. but unfortunately, it seems that, when alfalfa plants are under stress, then they always tend to show up just at the right time. So we do need to make sure that we are controlling those leaf hoppers. Typically, it's more economical if we do have really bad leaf hopper burn. Normally under normal conditions, you would just take a cutting and that would manage them appropriately. But like I mentioned earlier, if your alfalfa field is, 10 inches or less, it's not economical to take a cutting, and you're not going to be able to get rid of the hoppers then. So we are going to have to find a way of managing them, probably going to be with an insecticide application. The same is going to be true with armyworms, okay? It's just it's not economical to take a cutting, so we are going to still need to make sure that we are managing those insect pests. Same is going to be true with our diseases. If we have some, below average moisture conditions, probably not going to see a lot out there for diseases. That doesn't mean that they can't be out there. We still need to get out there and still scout and manage for them appropriately. But one of the other things you can do is, and we're going to lead into this here real shortly, is thinking about our pastures, trying to, if we can't take a cutting from the alfalfa field, okay, what can we do to maximize our pasture usage? So this is going to lead into making sure that we properly fertilize our pastures. What kind of shape can we try to maintain, keep those in? Can we maybe set up some paddocks, depending on our pasture ground, how it's laid out, how it's set up, your water availability. If you have the ability to set up paddocks, that's going to be a great thing. So when we switch gears here and we look at pastures, obviously drought's going to have a pretty big effect on pastures, especially the last 2 to 3 years. In many areas of the state, we've seen pastures that have absolutely really had a very difficult time trying to maintain, the stocking density that's been on them. They're not growing very well because we just haven't had the moisture, especially, during the summertime when we go into the summer slump. That really is a pretty stressful time on a lot of our pastures. So just like alfalfa fields, the timing of that drought stress is going to be very critical. Are those dry conditions coming on in the spring and the fall, when we typically see more of our cool season growth, with our cool season grasses? They grow mostly in the spring, and then we do see some bounce back in the fall before winter once our temperatures start coming back down from summertime. Or are the dry conditions, just during the summertime? Then it's probably not as bad, because during the summertime temperatures are getting warm very quickly, and our cool season grasses just aren't able to grow through that, and that's when we typically see that summer slump, right? Here in our next bullet point, a lot of our grasses are going to go dormant during that time. So if they're going dormant, if we don't have that limited moisture when they're in dormancy, then I'm not as concerned as I would be if we had drought limited condition, or if we had moisture limited conditions in the spring or the fall. And the last point that go along with that, a lot of our temperatures can help mitigate some of that stress. If it's going to be cooler, well, that does take quite a bit of that stress away. Obviously, we still need moisture, but if it can be cold and dry, then those plants aren't quite under as much stress as it would be if it was hot and dry. And our last point here, looking at cool season versus our warm season grasses. So typically in Iowa, a lot of our pastures are made up predominantly of cool season grasses. We see a lot of growth early in the springtime as our temperatures warm up. Those cool season grasses, they start to die down. They have very limited growth. A lot of them can potentially go dormant. And then once our temperatures start cooling back down coming into fall, we'll see a lot of those cool season grasses start coming back online, versus our warm season grasses, which really don't start growing till temperatures start warming up. I really like this graph here. I'd be remiss if I didn't include it as we look at our cool season grasses versus our warm season grasses. So cool season grasses, this is going to be your Kentucky bluegrass, your smooth brome, reed canary grass, timothy orchard grass, fescue, things like that. Your warm season grasses, switchgrass, big blue, Indian grass, things like that. You can see the cool season grasses in this chart. They're in green, We see a lot of growth early on in the springtime, but once our temperatures start creeping up in June, you can see that that growth curve for the cool season grasses really starts to dive down really fast. And it really doesn't start to come back online till about early mid-September, typically in a normal year, when we start to see our temperatures start to come back down a little bit. And then our cool season grasses will start to rebound and we can get some decent growth before wintertime. On the other side, our warm season grasses typically really don't start to do well until May, June, and they continue doing very well all the way through early fall. So this is where if a producer does have some pastures of warm season grasses, or if you have the ability to set up a pasture with just warm season grasses, you can really take advantage of the growing season here. When most of your pastures are starting to die down, you would have the availability to move your livestock over to a warm season pasture where that grass growth is going to be just coming online and doing really well. Another nice thing about warm season grasses is most of them have better, I'm not going to say great, but better tolerance to less than normal precipitation. Okay, so they're not going to be drought resistant, but they can tolerate drought conditions a little better than your cool season grasses. When we're looking at evaluating pastures, so a great resource here that's going to be posted below is a USDA pasture condition score sheet. This is something that I've gone through with several members of our beef specialist team. We go through this. We use this tool a lot when we're out doing pasture walks and different programs. And I find it to be a very helpful, very thorough resource that kind of makes you go through step by step and really take the time to evaluate how good is your pasture. Looking at it from the gravel road, things might look fine, but when you actually get out there and start walking around and roam around the entirety of your pasture, it really kind of forces you to look and see maybe where there's some shortcomings and maybe where we can probably do a little better job in some areas. It's a very simple, easy to use system, and it just very simply evaluates the pasture site amongst several different indicators, and you just give them a score of 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And after you're done, you add up all those scores to determine what your overall pasture condition score is. It's very simple, very easy to use. And then when you look at that total score, it'll help you determine what, if any, management changes may help your pasture. So we're just going to walk through this pasture condition score sheet, kind of indicator by indicator. Again, it's very simple, very easy to use. So the first one is your percent of desirable plants. So as you're out there and you're looking through, okay, what species of plants or grasses are out there? Are they useful? Are they desirable for your grazing animals? So if we have less than 20% of the pasture is desirable species, then you get 1 point. And you just simply go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on what percent of that stand out in your pasture are desirable plants that are going to be helpful for your grazing animals. Then the next line down, we look at the percent of the legumes by dry weight. So what kind of legumes are out there? And how much? Do we have some red clover, white clover, sweet clover, maybe some triticale, things like that? How much, what percent of the legumes are out there, okay? Next, we're looking at the live plant cover. So you do have to include, especially again, if it's the summertime and it's warm, you have to remember a lot of your cool season grasses are probably going to be dormant. So you do have to remember to include the dormant grasses. They might look like they're dead. They're not dead. They're just dormant, right? So you do have to include how much canopy is out there. Is it less than 40%? Well, then you're going to be 1 point. If you're 40 to 65, you're looking at 2 points, and you score appropriately from there. The next is your plant diversity. And I think this is probably one of the most important indicators out there is the diversity in your pasture. Because depending on what type of environmental conditions you have, Some plants may be able to tolerate different environmental conditions better than others. So the more diversity you have, the more species of desirable plants you have out there for grazing, the better off you're going to be. That's just common sense, right? So if our diversity is very, very low, less than 50%, or maybe we only have one dominant desirable species, we really don't have a whole lot out there. If it's just all straight brome, probably not going to be real great. Obviously, very low diversity. Versus something like a moderate amount of diversity, now we have 3 dominant species that are out there. We're sitting pretty good now. Obviously, the more diversity, the better off you're going to be. The higher points you should award that category. When we move on to plant residue and litter as soil cover. So how much bare soil is out there? Do you see a lot of areas that have a lot of bare soil? Bare soil is bad. Obviously, those are opportunities for weeds to take advantage because they have an open environment. There's nothing that's going to compete against them. Bare soil, leads to other problems as well. If we only have a few small openings of bare soil, but it's pretty minimal, then we're looking at 3 points. If you're fortunate enough where you can walk around your pasture and you can't see any bare soil anywhere at all, there's no, trails or anything like that, and things look great, give yourself 5 points in that category. Grazing utilization and severity. Here's an area where a lot of our pastures really suffered this past growing season and potentially the previous growing seasons, depending on how much drought stress you had out there. A lot of our pastures, through no fault of the producers, they're just overgrazed because, we're trying to keep, those cow-calf pairs out there. We're trying to keep those grazing animals out there as long as we can, hoping that it's going to rain. And unfortunately, a lot of our pastures just aren't able to maintain the growth. And, if we have, if that pasture is overstocked, we have more animal units on it than it can support. A lot of our pastures, it's very, very easy to overgraze them. Unless you have it specifically set up in a paddock system where you can try to do a really good job of rotating them from one paddock to another to try to minimize any overgrazing that occurs. I know one thing that one of my good friends, Denise Schwab, beef specialist, always says, we want to, when we're grazing, we want to think about, take half, leave half. And that's a great reminder that I try to give a lot of producers is when we think about grazing our pastures, we want to really make sure that, we're only taking half of the forage and we leave half. The shorter you graze those plants down, the longer it takes for them to rebound and come back. So you only do yourselves a favor if you can try to leave at least half the forage out there, then it takes less time for that forage to start regrowing and come back, and then you can come back sooner and graze it again. Okay. Livestock concentration areas. So the animals, where do they water? Where do they feed? Where do they congregate? That's going to play a role there. And then below that, your soil compaction and soil regeneration features. So do we have a lot of soil compaction? What's our root look like? You're going to have to take a shovel here and go in several places and see what your soil looks like, okay? Do we have a lot of compaction areas? Do we have, soils where our roots are, very shallow and they're pretty much going completely horizontal because they can't get down because they're facing several compaction layers? Or your roots looking really good? What's your soil color look like? And the last one, which is pretty easy once you get out there and you look with a shovel, what's your soil life look like? Do you have a lot of earthworms? Are you seeing a lot of other soil critters out there? How do things look? Plant vigor. What kind of recovery do your plants look like? After you get done harvesting or after you get done grazing them, how do the plants look? Are they pale yellow and brown? Does it take them a long time to come back? Like I just mentioned a little bit ago, if you take half, leave half, hopefully it shouldn't take them as long to start coming back and growing again, and they're going to look pretty good. Now we're moving on to erosion. Do we have any areas in that field, in that pasture where we're seeing a lot of erosion? What does that sheet and rill erosion look like? Do we see a lot of that happening in quite a few different areas? Is it only happening in just a few areas where our plants are really helping to mitigate a lot of that from happening? Do we have some areas where the wind, you can see where the wind is really blowing a lot of it away? If your pasture has some stream banks, what do those banks look like? Are the banks bare? Do we have some sloughing that's occurring? Do we have areas where there's no vegetation and it's just bare soil, and we're going to see every time we do see a hard rain or an intense rain, we're going to see, more erosion come from that bare stream bank? Or do we have, some vegetation that is there? Are the banks looking pretty good? Do we have some crossings where the cattle are going, where they're not tromping that stream bank down, and it looks pretty good? It's intact, it's stable. Okay. So after we get through all these different indicators, and you add up your score, hopefully this is where you need to get. So we're going to look at your overall pasture condition score. So obviously, if you're in the 10 to 15 total score points, things are looking pretty bad. Probably going to need to make some major efforts, some pretty big management considerations to try to improve things. As you have higher scores, obviously, maybe we need to make some changes, maybe nothing right now immediate, but some improvements are probably going to help benefit, the productivity of the pasture, but also going to help safeguard the environment as well. Something else to think about, don't just look at your total score, but also look at any of those individual indicator categories where you had very low scores. Did you have any areas where you only scored maybe a 1 or a 2? Well, those might be individual areas. So plant diversity, for example, if you scored a 1 or a 2 in plant diversity, then you probably really need to focus really heavy in that particular area to try to see what can I do to move from a score of a 1 or a 2 in plant diversity to maybe a 3 or a 4. So not only is it going to improve that category, but it's going to help all the other categories subsequently as well. When we look at management considerations for pastures, so especially coming off of extended drought period, the year before, maybe, the past 2 or 3 years, coming in on the spring, try to graze conservatively if you can. That's easier said than done, depending on how much moisture we had in the fall or through the winter coming into spring. If you can, try to set up rotational paddocks or establish a sacrifice paddock. That's going to help minimize how easy it could be to overgraze that pasture. If you have other paddocks that you can rotate those cattle or other grazing animals into, then that's going to make it a little easier to not fall victim to overgrazing those pasture areas as easily as it would be if you just had one big giant open pasture that they have free rein in. Because cattle, they're going to go through and they're going to find the areas that they enjoy grazing in, and they're going to keep going back to those areas. And you're going to have some areas that they're going to grub it all the way down to a very, very short level, and they're going to have other areas of the pasture that are going to, go past the efficiency, and now the cattle aren't going to bother with it. So you're going to lose some of those grazing areas as well. Along the lines, like we talked about, soil fertility for alfalfa fields, same is going to be true with maintaining the soil fertility levels in your pastures. So first thing and the easiest is addressing your soil pH and adding lime. That is definitely the easiest and the most economic thing to do. After we get your pH in line and get it where it needs to be, remember your pH for pastures should be about a 6.0. After we get that taken care of and squared away, then we can look at your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Remember that grasses respond very, very quickly to nitrogen. There are some considerations to keep in mind with that, and we'll talk about that here, I believe, the next slide. But along with nitrogen, remember that nitrogen fertilizer isn't going to do as good of a job if your P and your K levels are not where they need to be as well. So when we look at NPK, You really want to focus on all three of those at the same time and not just, well, I'm going to worry about nitrogen first and then worry about P and K. You really need to think about all three of them together as one solid front moving forward. So what about nitrogen for pastures? So there is no soil test for nitrogen like there is for P and K. But we need to also, when we're evaluating our stand, so like what you just did as the indicators, those individual indicators that we went through before, one of those was your species diversity, and along with that, how many legumes are out there. So when we were out there, you need to consider how much of that pasture is straight grass, how much is in a grass legume mix. If it's all just straight grass, okay, are they warm season grasses, cool season grasses? For most of Iowa, most of our pastures are going to be in cool season grasses. If it is just, straight grass, okay, do we want to make a one-time application of fertilizer, or do we want to make a split application? Unless you can graze all of it and we have enough moisture, it's probably going to be more economical to just do a one-time fertilizer application in early spring and probably be good there. Now, if we do have some legumes out there in that pasture, if we have some red clover, some sweet clover, white clover, whatever it might be, maybe triticale, how many legumes are out there? So if we have less than a third of a stand of legumes, additional nitrogen is going to be beneficial. If we have at least a third of that stand in the pasture is legumes, then really those legumes should provide all the nitrogen that pasture needs, and applying additional nitrogen probably isn't worthwhile. So when we think about applying nitrogen in the pasture, if a little is good, a lot has to be better, right? Well, that really depends if you can use all of it or not. Like I said, do you have enough cow-calf pairs out there where you can graze all of that forage at one time, so that way the grass doesn't outpace how fast the cattle can graze it all? Maybe, maybe not. Typically what happens is we have too much grass early on and we not enough cattle, and as time goes along we have not enough grass and too many cattle. So can you graze it all? Well, maybe, maybe not. A one-time application in usually late March, early spring is going to be about the best time. A good starting point, and this is going to depend on your stocking density and timing as well, but a good starting point is probably going to be around 50 to 80 pounds of nitrogen for that late March, early April timing, all right? If you can use ammonium sulfate, that's going to be the best option. Probably it may not be available everywhere. Depending on the cost, it may not be the most cost effective versus urea. Typically, I do see a lot of nitrogen applied as urea in most pastures if they are going to apply any. If you could, though, ammonium sulfate is definitely the best option. That being said, before you even think about applying any nitrogen out there or any phosphorus or any potassium, we do need to make sure that our weeds are appropriately managed and controlled. If not, you're literally fertilizing the weeds that are out there, and it's going to be very easy for those weeds to get out ahead of you, and you're going to have a very difficult time controlling them. So when we look at weed management in our pastures, like I just said, we really need to make sure that we get our weeds under control before we even think about putting fertilizer out there. And if we're honest with ourselves, most of our pastures probably are not managed well enough for weeds. They're the last ones that get attention. Unfortunately, a lot of our pastures, there's a reason that they're probably not being grown with other crops because they're probably not the most easily accessible, which also means that they're probably not easily accessible for weed management. However, if you can get in there with a side-by-side or four-wheeler, or even just getting there on foot and spot spraying the really, really bad patches, that's going to significantly help try to keep those weeds under control. So there's a few different strategies. You can intensively graze it. You can graze everything down. You can mob graze with a bunch of cattle, get in there and just have them completely mow the whole thing down. You can physically get in there if it's level enough and safe enough and get in there with a tractor a four-wheeler maybe pulling a pull-behind mower, to mow weeds down. And then obviously is the use of herbicides. So there's pros and cons with each strategy, costs that come with each of those. Grazing and mowing, probably going to have to be more than one pass. Mowing can help suppress a lot of weeds, but typically mowing, it's not going to kill a lot of those weeds. It's going to help just suppress them versus, herbicides. And even a lot of herbicides may take one or two passes before you get really effective control for a lot of the weeds that may be out there in those pastures. We typically see a lot of our weeds in pastures easily controlled in the springtime. However, there are some weeds out there that we can get really good control in the fall as well. So your thistles here, for example, fall can be a great time to control those as well. Other things to think about when we're evaluating pastures. So if we do have a really poor pasture stand, if we notice that there are a lot of really open, bare areas where you see just bare soil, we have a lot of really thin stands, there's a good chance that that pasture could really benefit from something like a frost seeding or an interseeding, where we have an opportunity to really plus up that stand, thicken it up. Frost seeding is probably the easiest. The best time to do it is going to be towards the end of winter, beginning of spring, where we see a lot of frost freeze cycles, just like the name suggests, frost seeding. The key here is we really need to make sure we have a lot of bare spots or a very thin stand. The idea is we want to have minimal competition with the existing plants in that pasture. We want to try to provide the best opportunity for those new seedings as they germinate and start to grow. We want them to do well and get established, and we don't want to have a lot of competition for that. In order for that to happen, if you are planning on frost seeding this next spring, normally we would tell you not to graze it down really, really hard. But overgrazing a pasture might actually be a good thing then, because you're creating a lot of bare spots or minimal cover, and you're allowing opportunities for those new seedlings to do well next spring. If you are thinking about doing a frost seeding, the best legume, my recommendation is to go with a medium red clover. Medium red clover does a great job of getting established, getting up and growing. It does very, very well. A close second would be white clover. Those would be probably my number one and number two choices. If you are thinking about frost seeding, just stick with the legumes. I would definitely not recommend trying grasses in that mix for frost seeding. Grasses have a very difficult time getting established through the frost seeding method. It's best reserved for just legumes. If you do want to plus up your pasture stand with grasses, then the best way of going about that is going to be with either interseeding with something like a no-till drill, or coming in there and if you have really large areas of bare soil, you could come in and do it by hand as well if you had a rake or something. But the key is with grasses, you have to have some way of incorporating those grasses into the soil. They don't have to be scratched in very deep, even a quarter to a half an inch is fine, but you do have to have some way of physically incorporating, interseeding, or scratching in those grasses like Timothy or orchard grass or smooth brome, whatever it might be, into that soil to get them physically in there, okay? So some take-home thoughts. We've talked about a lot here with forage stands, whether it's an alfalfa field or a pasture, whatever it might be. You need to do your due diligence and carefully go out, take your time, make some good observations, and evaluate those forage stands. In the alfalfa field, go out there with your square, your 1 foot by 1 foot square, and really take the time to go out there throughout the field, throw it a lot of good places, so you get a really good understanding of how the field is across the entire field, not just the best or the worst areas. But then, take the time, dig up the plants, take out your pocket knife, split them open, make sure that those plants are as healthy as they look from the outside, okay? And really take the time to think, okay, how old is this stand? Is it a 3rd year, 4th year stand, or is it a new seeding? How many healthy plants do I have out there? okay, is this enough? Is it worth, continuing that stand on, or do I need to think about potentially renovating it, maybe reseeding it? Okay. And when you talk about your pastures, as you're out there making observations and going through your pasture, what's my species diversity look like? Do I have any bare spots? What's my weed pressure look like throughout this pasture? Okay. How bad is it overgrazed? Pest management. With our forages, insects is really going to be a big one. So are the weeds. Making sure that we really try to stay on top of our insect pressure. Take your time, get out there, scout appropriately, and when our insects reach those economic thresholds, either take a cutting if it's an alfalfa field, like for leaf hoppers, for example. Taking a cutting is a great way to manage them. But if your alfalfa stands too short and you can't take a cutting, then we need to take appropriate actions and probably make an application to keep those leaf hoppers in check. Okay. And then, your weeds in the pastures, really trying to make sure that our pastures are as, can we control the weeds and suppress them as well as we can to try to allow those beneficial grasses, the desirable grasses, to grow, and we can get as much forage off that pasture as we really need to. Your third point, and this goes for both alfalfa and pastures, really need to make sure that we're maintaining those optimal soil fertility levels. Taking the time, go out, take a good soil sample, do your soil fertility testing, looking at the results, using PM 1688 to see, okay, based on the results that I got, what do I need to put out here for a soil fertility amendment? Okay. Our fourth point, think about your grazing management. What kind of grazing management style do you have? I ruminate on that for a while. What kind of management strategy do you have? Do you have any rotational paddocks? If you don't, why not? Do you have the ability to set up or establish any rotational paddocks? If you do, that's going to significantly help your grazing strategy and allow you to keep moving those grazing animals from one paddock to the next to really help minimize the potential of overgrazing a particular paddock. And lastly, consider any additional renovations if it's warranted. So with your pastures, if we have some really thin stands, if it's, you see a lot of bare spots out there, do we need to do any frost seeding with some legumes maybe in the springtime? Early spring, we still have some frost freeze cycles, maybe. If you're thinking about grasses, plussing your pasture up with grasses, then look at some interseeding. And for your alfalfa fields, depending on the age of that field, do we need to potentially come in and reseed it? That's where you just have to really take the time, go through and evaluate how good that stand really is. Is it worth continuing, or do we need to just look at maybe starting over and starting with a blank slate? So here's some helpful resources. And again, these are down here at the bottom. There was information from these that I took throughout this presentation. So obviously we have how to take a good soil sample and make good fertilizer decisions. I mentioned PM 1688 several times. That's our general guide for crop nutrient and limestone recommendations in Iowa. PM 869 is fertilizing pastures, a lot of information in there. And then if you choose to do some frost seeding, there's information there in PM 856. PM 1362, how to evaluate your hay and pasture stands for winter injury. There's some really good information in there, not only about winter injury, but how to properly evaluate your stands when they're under extended periods of stress as well. And then talked quite a bit about that USDA pasture condition score sheet as well. So some really good, helpful resources, a lot of information out there. I kind of really only just really touched the tip of the iceberg with this presentation, all the information that's out there. So I appreciate you for watching this episode of Crops TV. Had a lot of good information that we covered on how to evaluate forages, whether it's your alfalfa field or your pasture. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, the other field agronomists that are stationed around the state, and we would be more than happy to talk with you about any questions or comments that you might have. Thanks again, and take care.